So here we are again, March 18, and today it's number, what is it? 84, I think, of the webinars. Yeah, 84 is quite a number already. And I'm welcoming our speaker of today, Tine Starič. Tine is working for Companion and sitting in Vilnius. I'm making fun of it, but desperately longing for spring and summer to come around, being from Slovenia, one of my favorite countries. I know that, and I've been in Lithuania also, that it's quite a challenge probably for you to be there, but I'm very happy that you're here on the show today. My name is Luc van Vugt, as all of you might know. Today again I'm the moderator, and yes, as always, moving through a couple of practical slides. As you might know, you're very welcome to step in with questions, but use the question window for that. Your microphone is muted and stays muted. I will pick them up and I will post them to Tine. We've agreed that I will post them at the point where we're at in the presentation, if that makes sense, and otherwise we wait with it till the end of the webinar. So be welcome to be part of the show, of course, by putting in your questions. I'll do my best again to get it on YouTube as fast as possible. Don't always succeed in the evening hours, but surely tomorrow morning I'll get them in. I'm always very busy to get that table of content, that those timetabling things in the comments, and that's always the most work. Of course, you know where to find it and share it. Be also welcome, if you didn't subscribe to our newsletter, to do so, or share it with people you know, so they're in the know. Well, a bigger part of this season went quite smoothly, getting new webinars on the show. We have still 3 ahead, 1 in 4 weeks time, because in between in 2 weeks there's Monday, Easter Monday, which is a public holiday. Sometimes I run the show on that day, but I decided this year not to. So in 4 weeks time we'll have our new MVP, Patrick Schiever, talk about object-oriented approaches, a presentation he did at Directions in Lyon, and I was really pleased the way he did it, so I asked him to join in. Then 4 weeks later, Dimitri Katson want to talk about art of docs. He's doing a lot with ChatGPT and his Business Central, what is it, IQ or QI, what is it called? His website and whatever, and he has run a lot into documents and the way you do that. In May, 4 weeks later, we'll have my colleague Niall McGovern talking about Copilot and AI. And yes, as always, trying to enthuse you to come up with topics or be a speaker. We've got, for the remaining part of this season, which run till summer on the Northern Hemisphere, on June 10 and June 24 and July 8, I have 3 time slots available. So if you're open to that or could suggest somebody for that, be free to do so. So be very welcome. And yes, these are my, practical things that I want to share with you. And of course, I'm going to thank our sponsor for enough to enable us to do this. And I'm going to make you, Tine, presenter. And while you're selecting your things, Tine stepped in, quite recently, although this was originally planned to be a session by AJ, but due to private reason that didn't work out. And then somehow Tine was very open to step in on a short notice on this one. And yes, come up with a presentation you did on Days of Knowledge, almost, 3/4 of a year ago. But I'm very pleased that you want to rerun it here, because it makes sense to share it with more than just, as I understood, the small audience you had back in Odense in June last year. So the floor is yours, Tine. Have fun.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Luc. Thank you for having me again. And to everyone else, welcome to Automating Code Quality, a guide to using custom code analysis for AI. Like Luc said, I already did this session in Days of Knowledge Nordic, but this session is really close to me. I like talking about it. And it's because this was my first pet project that I did when I joined Companion. At the time, I joined the project working with a German partner where they were trying to re-platform one of their old solutions to Business Central. That means all of their developers, they didn't come from an NAV background. They came from all of the other languages. And when they came with the project to us, they had all sorts of coding conventions that I was not used to put it that way. For example, all the if statements needed to be encased in brackets. All of the exit statements needed to be capitalized. The global variables needed to be prefixed with the G. And all of those legal coding conventions that they wanted us to follow, they put a lot of strain on the code review, because the code reviewer then had to go, hey, you missed the bracket here. Hey, you missed the capitalized exit there. And at that point, I started thinking there must be a better way how we can catch those small things before the code reviewer has to go through everything. And all the mature languages, they have the idea of linting, and luckily we also do in AL, and that's what the session is going to be about. Now, before we move further on, I'd like to take a quick minute just to introduce myself. My name is Tine Starič. I work at Companion, and as Luc mentioned at the beginning, I'm originally from Slovenia, though for the past couple of years, I've been flying under the Lithuanian flag now. Just recently, I moved from being a developer working every day with AL code to being an architect at Companion. That just means that I now don't only focus on AL, but I also tend to focus on how can we make the developers more efficient? How can we increase the productivity? And this topic that we're talking about today, well, it fits the bill quite well. In regards to the agenda, we're going to touch upon 5 topics today. We're going to start with what is code analysis and why is it important. We're going to take a look at what are the existing solutions, so what Microsoft has given us, what the community has built, and when neither of the two fit quite right with you, how can we create our custom linter for AL, which is going to be the 3rd point. Now, throughout the presentation, I might say custom linters, I might say code analysis tools, I might say code analyzers. These all mean the same thing, a tool that helps us analyze the code. When we're done looking at how we can create our custom linters, we're going to talk about how do we integrate them with our development workflows, meaning how do we include them in VS Code, but also how do we include them in our pipelines. And finally, I've collected quite a couple of linting use cases, how we use internally our code analyzer to make our lives easier. And hopefully that gets you excited that this is a cool idea and maybe you should do the same thing within your organizations. Now, if we start at the beginning, what is code analysis and why is it important? I think we can all agree that we want clean code. We want maintainable code. We want readable code. But in order to get there, it means that we put a lot of pressure on the code reviewer. The code reviewer has to then go through everything and point out the smallest little things. Now, this is where the code analysis tools start to shine. Because what is code analysis? It's a way to examine source code before the program is run. Technically speaking, it's a .NET library containing rules to validate source code against. So in a way, when the compiler is going through our AL objects, when it's compiling our code, it will check against the rules that we will create in C#. And if any of those rules are invalidated, it's going to throw a warning. Now, what does code analysis bring? It increases the quality. It helps us find mistakes faster. It helps us standardize code. And for me, one of the important notes is it also accelerates the development cycle. Because the less time we're going to spend going back and forward between the reviewer and the developer under review, the sooner we can actually ship those features to customers and they can benefit from them. Now you can think of how everything works as similar to how events in Business Central work. So whenever a compiler, for example, finds a local variable, it's gonna raise an event, and with our code analysis tool, we are going to subscribe to that event and say, oh, you found a local variable, please give that to me because I would like to analyze if the naming of the local variable is correct. Now, let's talk a little bit about the existing solutions that are already available to us. I believe most of you are already familiar with the 4 COPs that come from Microsoft: App Source COP, Code COP, UI COP, and Per Tenant Extension COP. These are the COPs that say your action is missing an image, or your object is missing your app source prefix. Now, I'm not going to be talking too much about these 4 COPs because, like I said, I believe everybody's familiar with them. Instead, I'll move on to the second point, Business Central Linter COP. Now, this is a community-driven project. It was started by Stefan Maron, and at this point, I think it has something over 50 different rules which can help us make our code even better, even more maintainable. Now, in this part, I want to first show you how easy it is to include the Linter COP, the community-driven analyzer, in your VS Code. And then we're also going to go to the website where the whole project is hosted, and I'll explain how you can contribute to this project. So let me jump into my Visual Studio Code over here. This is going to be a small project that we'll get back to later when we're testing our custom analyzer. But right now, what I want to show you is that if you search for an extension in the marketplace, but I already have it installed, the extension for businesscentral.lintercop. Once you install this extension, what you will get is a shortcut down here at the bottom that says ALCops. And when you click on it, it allows you to enable the code cops that you would like to use on your project, something like code cop, per tenant extension cop, but also you can enable the Business Central linter cop. Once you enable it here, you click OK, linter cop gets added to your project, and you start getting warnings for additional rules that you might invalidate with your code. So it is really simple for developers to pick it up. Now, let's jump to GitHub, where the whole project is hosted. You can find it at github.com/stefanmaron/businesscentral.lintercop. This is where you're gonna find the full source code for this tool. And before I go any further, I'd like to thank Arthur. I'm not sure, Arthur, if you're ever going to listen to this recording, but if you are, you're doing a great job, and you can't see me because the camera's turned off, but I'm showing 2 thumbs up. I met Arthur at Directions last year, and he approached me because he already knew that we have our internal companion cop analyzer as well. And together we moved quite a couple of rules to this community-driven analyzer. Anyway, talking about the linter cop, like I said, here's the source code. Under releases, you can find the compiled versions that you can use in your pipelines. And if we scroll over to the README, the important part is here where all of the rules are listed. And you can see that now it has become quite a collection. The first time I came across linter cop, we had, I think, 8 rules, and now we're already at 53. So if you are going to start using linter cop and you find any issues with it, I would invite you to just open them up here because you're probably not the only one. If you are going to create your own custom linter and you have some cool rules that you've implemented, I would really invite you to create a pull request with those, bring them back to the community, and let everyone benefit from your work. And even if you're not as technical, you can always just contribute in the discussions tab over here. Maybe you have an idea what could be a possible new rule, or maybe you can just weigh in on existing discussions over here. And when the discussions get enough traction, maybe somebody else from the community will pick it up and implement it. So that's a short introduction to the linter cup. But now let's say you're already using the 4 cups from Microsoft. You're also using the linter cup, but you still have some coding conventions that your organization uses that you still feel like they could be automated. That's when custom code analysis comes into play. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a quick overview of Companion Cup, which is the tool that we're using internally. The source code for Companion Cup is also on GitHub. You can freely browse it. You can use it as a starting point. You can use it as a way to learn how to implement new rules. And then we're going to go through the steps how you can create a new rule. And once we have a new rule, we're going to test it out. I'll also show you how you can debug it. So this part is going to get quite a bit more technical. It's going in the C# direction, but I don't want you to get discouraged by this. The idea here is not that I create a step-by-step guide on how you create custom code analyzers. It's more to present to you the idea that this is possible, and it's not really that difficult to create such an analyzer. Before we move on, I still need to share the support and maintainability disclaimer with you. What I mean by support disclaimer is that officially, Microsoft does not support custom code analysis. Now, our tools will work, but because it's not officially supported, there's no documentation around it. You cannot Google how will I implement a new rule for AL analyzers. The good thing is that it actually really closely follows the framework for Roslyn analyzers. So if you ever think I would like to read more about this, in 95% of cases, you can go to the Roslyn documentation, which some of you might know from the C# world, and you can read about it there. The maintainability disclaimer relates to the fact that since Microsoft doesn't officially support custom code analysis, they also don't care that they are breaking our tools with each new major version of AL language. That means our custom analysis tool that works today for AL language 11 will no longer work tomorrow for AL language 12. And that means we have to pay attention each April and each October because that's when the AL languages get updated. It's not hard to get it ready for the next version. I'll show you in a minute, but it is something that you should think about. So let's jump to Companion Cup's source code now. You can find it at github.com/companion/Companion Cup. The whole structure really closely follows the linter cup because it came as a fork of linter cup a few years ago. You can find the full source code here. Under releases, again, you can find the compiled versions. And in the README, you can read all about the rules that we have implemented in our own tool. Now here, I'd like to mention that Companion Cup is meant to be an addition to linter cup, which means over time, we have already transferred a couple of rules to linter cup. I wish that, well, I hope that we will transfer more in the future. But why am I saying this? If you end up using Companion Cup, which you're completely free to do so, if you find any issues if you find issues, do report them. But if you have more ideas for which rules you would like to see developed, I would prefer that you open those discussions on linter cup, where we can create them and a much wider community can actually benefit from them. Okay. Let's switch to Visual Studio now. This is where you will end up once you clone the Companion Cup's repository. The first thing that I want to show you is how do we solve the issue I mentioned a couple of moments ago when the new AL language is released. You can see that our companion cop has a couple of dependencies. Most of these are not a problem. However, these three, Microsoft Dynamics NAV Analyzers Common, NAV Code Analysis, and NAV Code Analysis Workspaces, these three always break with new AL language version. How do we fix those? Well, for that, we have to go to our AL language extension folder. Usually that's going to be in your users folder, .vs Code, extensions, Microsoft Dynamics SMB AL extension. And then in the bin folder under analyzers, this is where you can find the DLLs that we need. You simply have to copy the 3 DLLs in question and bring them into your project. Once you have the new DLLs from the newest version of the language in your project, you simply rebuild it and it is going to work with the newer version. Keep in mind though that if you build it for version 13, it will no longer work with version 12. Okay. Now if we move to the actual rules, each of the rules is implemented as a separate C# class. Today, we're going to be looking at this rule number 13 here. The name is tooltip punctuation, and you can already think about it. This is going to check if a tooltip ends with a dot or not. Something really simple, but it's something that we don't have to check during the code reviews anymore because we have a rule for it. But before we talk about the class itself, we first have to start in a different file. We have to start in diagnostic descriptors. You can think of diagnostic descriptors as just a container of information about my rule. So what is the ID of my rule? What is the message that should be shown to the developer when that rule is raised? Should the rule throw a warning, an error, an info, or nothing at all? We're again going to be looking at the diagnostic descriptor for rule number 13. And the way how you would start with creating a diagnostic descriptor for a custom rule is that you would just copy one of the existing ones, paste it, and start changing things around. The first thing that you would change is the ID. The ID consists of a prefix and a sequential number. If you are going to be changing the prefix, keep in mind that the prefix has to be exactly 2 characters long. Not 1, not 3, it has to be 2, otherwise the analyzer won't work properly in the pipelines. Next, we have to specify what kind of message should be shown to the developer when this rule is invalidated. We have to specify the title, the format, and the description. Now, for most of our rules, we actually use a resource manager to manage those strings, which means we add those strings to the file over here, companion cop analyzer.resx. And then we have individual functions that go to that resource manager and retrieve the correct string. But today, to keep things light, to keep things simple, I'll show you that you can also just hard code the values directly into the parameter of the diagnostic descriptor creator. Most of the rules have all 3, title, format, and description as the same value, but that's not necessarily always the case. There are a couple of other parameters. I won't go through all of them. The last one that I want us to pay attention to is the default severity, diagnostic severity, where this is where you define, should this be a warning, or should it be an error, or should it be an info? And that can always be overwritten using a, oh, I forgot the name, the JSON file. I have it on the slides later.
Is it the rule set?
Rule set, yeah, thank you, Luc. The rule set.json file where you can increase or decrease the severity of the rule. Okay, once we have the diagnostic descriptor in place, we can start looking at the class. Now, again, if I was creating a new rule, I would first try to look for a rule that already does something similar to what I wanted to do. I would copy paste it and start changing things around. But I still want to explain a bit what's actually happening in this class over here. To create a class for a diagnostic rule, we need to inherit from diagnostic analyzer parent class. And then we have to override two functions from that parent class. The first one that we have to override is supported diagnostics. This one is used to communicate to the compiler what kind of warnings can it expect out of this class. And you can see that here we're just specifying, hey, from this class, you can expect to get warnings for rule number 13. Here we're just passing in our diagnostic descriptor that we've created. And the second one that we have to override, which is more important, I would say, is the initialize one. In initialize is where we are actually going to subscribe to those compiler events. Now, again, you cannot see me because the camera is off, but every time I say events, I'm actually doing air quotes because they're not really events, but for the way how we think about them, I'll continue using events because this is a concept that's close to us. The way we subscribe to an event is by using the register action syntax. Let's go first through the name here. Register syntax node action. What this means is that we would like to register an action that should be executed whenever a compiler finds a syntax node. And that's exactly what's happening in the parameters as well. What we're saying with the first parameter is, when you find a syntax node, I would like you to execute this analyze tooltip punctuation action, which is actually just a function that I have declared here. We'll get to this in a bit. I would like you to execute this action whenever you find a syntax node of type page field or a syntax kind of type page action, because we know page fields and page actions have tooltips. Now, yesterday when I was preparing for this webinar, I actually remembered that now with version 24, we're getting tooltips also on table fields. So I will have to adjust this rule so that it also checks for the tooltips on table fields. But if we just go through this again, how do we subscribe to a compiler event? We use the register action command, where we say we would like to register an action, analyze tooltip punctuation, whenever you find a syntax node of type page field or page action. Now, before we go into the action itself, let me just show you that there are plenty of different ways how you can, again, subscribe to the event. You can use the register syntax node action, register syntax tree action, code block, symbol action. If you'd like to know more about these and when you should use them, you can refer again to the Rosalind documentation, because this part is exactly the same as it is in the Rosalind documentation when they talk about registering actions. Let's get back to our class and let's check the analyze tooltip punctuation function over here. Every rule in our repository starts with these two lines over here. And what the first two lines check is if the containing symbol is obsolete, or if the containing object is obsolete, then don't check anything. Which means if the page field is obsolete, or if the whole page is obsolete, then we won't be executing any rules, because that code is going outside of our code base sooner rather than later, and we simply don't care. If it's not obsolete, that's when we start working with it. First, we're going to try and get the tool property out of the syntax node. And if the tool property is not null, which means the tooltip is actually defined on the page field, we will try to get its value. And once we have the value, it's just a simple comparison. Does the value end with a dot? Well, does the value not end with a dot? or does the value not end with a dot and a closing bracket, then throw a warning. How do we throw a warning? We do it using the report diagnostic procedure over here, where we specify again which warning we would like to throw, where we pass in our diagnostic descriptor from before. And we have to also specify where should this warning appear, where's on which location, and this is used for the squiggly line. Where should the developer see the squiggly line for this warning? Once you're done with that, once you have your class ready, once you have your rule set up that is going to report the diagnostic in a certain case, well, now we just have to build the whole project up. I'm going to go over to build solution, build succeeded. Now, I'm just going to quickly show you what's the default path where this project would, let's say, drop off the build tool. It would be in the repository. So this is the repository that we were just working in. In the bin folder, under debug, version of .NET framework that we're using, and companion copy analyzer. This is now our compiled analysis tool. So next, let's test it out. I'm going to jump into Visual Studio Code for this. And you can see here that I have a simple page defined here that has an action. That action has a tooltip, and tooltip does not end with a dot. Currently, there are no warnings here. That's because the analysis tool has not been loaded into the project yet. Now you can define the analyzers either in the user settings or in the workspace settings, but personally, when I'm developing new rules, I prefer to create a new settings.json file under the .vs code folder. And this is where I enable the settings that I need. These are probably already familiar to you. These are the same settings that you would set up if you want to enable app source cop or code cop. We need to enable code analysis. And in the code analyzers, this is where you specify the path to your DLL that we've just created. I'm gonna uncomment this. Now, usually you have to reload the project in order for VS Code to pick up an additional code analyzer. So let's just do that. And while everything is loading, there's also this third setting, which I'll get to a bit later, output analyzer statistics. This one is quite useful if you will be developing your own analyzers. But let's get to this a bit later. Let's check our page. Currently, nothing's yet happening because we need to wait for the workspace to load and for the objects and symbols to load. Should be soon enough. There we go. Now you can see that I have a warning on my tooltip, and it says tooltip must end with a dot. So our analyzer works. One more thing that I would like to show you is how do we debug a rule that we are creating? And the reason why I think this is an important topic right now is because debugging is not, well, I won't say it's difficult, but it's a slightly different approach that we're used to as BC developers. I'll put a breakpoint over here. And normally what you would do is you would head on over to debug and start debugging. But this is not going to work here because the project does not create a program that we can directly debug. It only creates a library that a different program is using. So instead of start debugging, we have to use attach to process. We have to attach to a process that's using our library that we've created. So let's attach to a process. And the process that we're looking for is called Microsoft Dynamics Nav Editor Services Host. If you would have multiple Visual Studio codes opened with multiple AL projects, there would be multiple processes with the same name. So I would suggest that you only work with one open project at a time. Otherwise, you will have a hard time figuring out which process to attach to. Let's attach. And let's go to VS Code. There's two ways how we can trigger that breakpoint. Either I could just make any simple change in my editor over here, or I can also build the project. Both of these will trigger the breakpoint. You can see that the focus immediately switched to Visual Studio, and now I can jump around this procedure, this function. I can see what's happening. I can see which properties are coming in as context, what properties are available on the syntax node. And to me, the debugger here is really important because we don't have official documentation. So I cannot go read what kind of properties are available on a specific syntax node. That's why I was using debugger extensively to learn what is available to me on page fields or page actions that I can then use to create my rules. Okay, I'm just gonna let it go through because I want to show you one more thing. The setting that we mentioned earlier, output analyzer statistics. If you enable this, what it gives you is when your project is built, it will also show you the time that each individual rule from your analyzer has used up. And this can be really useful if you're developing some rules that are more performance heavy, and you can validate how well are they performing. This is something I use whenever we create a new rule. I check it out on larger projects just to see, will this be a huge performance impact? Because if the rules are running slow, then nobody really wants them. Okay, and that's actually the end of the coding section. So let me jump back to the presentation. We've built our analyzer tool. Now let's talk about how do we implement it with our development workflows. We've already seen how we can do it in VS Code. Here, what I'd like to additionally mention is the way how we set up our projects. Whenever we start a new AL project, we create a workspace file where we define all the code analyzers that need to run on that project. And we also include a rule set file where we disable some rules, enable some rules, and when a new developer would need to join that project, they can already see the errors that they need to see, and they don't see the ones that they shouldn't see. So having a rule set in your workspace file really helps with onboarding new people. On the other side of things, in the pipelines, BC Container Helper fully supports custom code cops. Both compile app in BC Container and run AL validation. Both of these have a parameter called custom code cops, where you simply pass in a path to your DLL, and your analyzer is going to be used as well to throw warnings. If you're using ALGo for GitHub or ALOps, I haven't played too much with either of these, but I did check that they both support custom code cops. Okay, and now I'm going to show you a couple of use cases, how we use Companion cop internally to catch runtime errors, to catch a couple of maintainability, extensibility, and readability improvements for coding conventions, and a couple of nice-to-haves. First, we're going to start with runtime errors. These are mostly caught by Microsoft's code cops. However, there are still a couple that have slipped through Microsoft. One of those, the example of one of these is here. I'll give you a couple of seconds to try and think about what is wrong with this part of code. It's in black and white because that's how you see code in Azure DevOps. Well, as a reviewer, I personally couldn't tell what's wrong here. But if you would run this piece of code, you would get this error. The sales LCY field in the customer ledger entry table must be a flow field. because we were trying to invoke set autocalc fields on a field that's not a flow field. The problem that we had wasn't really with customer ledger entries. It was when a developer created a custom table and added a flow field there, so they added it to the set autocalc fields. But later on, they realized, oh, this field actually should be normal, but they forgot to update the set autocalc fields. It's a small thing, it doesn't happen often, but at the same time, it was really easy to automate, and now we never have to worry about a runtime issue like that. Okay, another example of runtime errors, and this one I'm actually really proud that the team, our internal team, developed this rule. Here's the change you have been proposed to in Azure DevOps. Somebody added 4 fields to the customer table. Any ideas what could be wrong with a simple change like that? Actually, as a reviewer, you cannot know what is wrong here, but the issue is that 2 months before, somebody has also added fields to the contact table. And if you check the field number 50,103, on the left side, it's strict confidentiality, which is a Boolean field. On the right side, it's legislation office, which is a text 50. Now, there is a standard Business Central functionality that allows you to create a customer out of a contact. And what that functionality uses is transfer fields. Transfer fields will try to jam all of the fields that are on same IDs from the source table to the destination table. And if you merge code like this to your solution, when you try to create a customer out of a contact, you will get an error saying, wait, what do you mean? I cannot move legislation office text to strict confidentiality Boolean. And that's actually hard to track during the code reviews, because we would have to constantly have in our minds which tables are paired together. And let me ask you this. Luc, I'll ask you, how many table pairs do you think are there in base app that are coupled the way contact is coupled to customer?
Well, contact is also coupled to vendor and bank account.
Yeah.
So the 2 others. Yeah, I don't know the others.
The answer that we came to right now is 191.
Oh, right.
There are 191 different table pairs that are coupled together. And by automating all of that, we made it possible that we can avoid this kind of collisions, because otherwise I have no idea how somebody could keep track of that.
Yeah, nice.
Another example is this. Let's say you have 2 custom tables, contract and contract archive. You're going to use a transfer fields to move data from one to the other. You won't get a runtime error, because the first field is an integer in both cases. The second field is a text in both cases. Third field, a date. Fourth field, also a date. However, if you look at the last 2 fields, you are going to have a functional issue, because a contract date is going to be moved into expiration date, and expiration date is going to get moved to a contract date. So we've extended the transfer fields validation rule that it compares also custom tables, and if the IDs match, then the names must match as well as types. And by doing that, we can actually have transfer fields which we trust don't do anything stupid, so to say. Next, we have some maintainability improvements. These are really cool when you have to get back to your own code or somebody else's code 6 months later or 12 months later. One example is with commit. This rule comes from linter. And what it says is commit needs a comment to justify its existence. Now, commit is a powerful function. Sometimes we need it, but the problem is 6 months later, we won't know why we've used the commit here. By having a rule that dictates that there needs to be a comment explaining why is the commit here, we will have less trouble maintaining this code. A different example is with internal methods. You can see the procedure here doesn't do anything special. It initializes the customer record, it assigns a number, it assigns a name, and then it inserts it. But 6 months from now, you again won't know, did the developer want to skip the trigger, or have they just forget to specify the parameter? That's why we added this rule that says internal methods must be invoked with explicit parameters, and we have that on insert, on modify, on delete all, on modify all, so that we can better track intentionality. What did the developer actually want to do? We have some extensibility improvements. Now, these can be a hit or miss with you. We personally quite like them whenever we start a new project, especially if that project is targeting app source. The rules we have is that every procedure must either be local or internal. It cannot be external. And all of the objects need to be internal and non-extensible. The reason for these rules is that, well, obsolescence process is a bit of a pain, to say the least. But I also agree that over time, as the extension matures, you slowly want to open up your extension so that it becomes extensible. When it's still on a case-by-case basis, we disable those rules with pragmas. But when the extension comes to the maturity point that it just generally needs to be extensible, we turn these rules off. And then it's up to the developer to think and decide, should a procedure be internal or should a procedure be external? Readability improvements. That was also a huge success. Take a look at this snippet over here. We have a procedure, a global variable section, a trigger, a procedure, another trigger, another procedure. It's a mess. Now, why is it a mess? We don't know. Maybe the developer didn't care. Maybe they made a mistake. Maybe this is just part of some merge conflict that got resolved a bit weirdly. It doesn't matter how we ended up in this situation. What matters is that we would like a different ordering to be followed. We would like to have global variables first, then triggers, then methods. So now we have a rule that is going to add a squiggly line every time somebody would place a trigger in a wrong place or a procedure in a wrong place. Another one is coding conventions. These are more client specific. Like I mentioned at the beginning, when we had the partner that wanted to have global variables prefixed or exit statements capitalized, we have rules for that so that we don't have to track those tiny little changes during the code review. And the last group is nice to haves. These don't add much, but they do help us keep our code standardized. On the left side, you can see two procedures, one that ends with a semicolon, one that doesn't. Does that make any difference? None whatsoever. But like I said, we want to have our code standardized. So at some point we just said, look, let's not declare procedures with a semicolon at the end. And now we have a rule that adds a warning for that. On the right side, we have a rule that says empty captions should be locked. The reason for this is empty enum values are quite common, but with an empty caption, you also get a line in your translation file. Now, nobody is going to translate empty captions anyway. So in order to at least somewhat reduce the size of the translation file, we agreed that empty captions should be locked and will therefore stay out of the translation file. And with that, we come to our conclusion. A couple of things that I would like you to take away from this session. First off, turn on Microsoft's analyzers, and then check the linter cop, check what the community has already created. Next, I would like you to think about what are the coding conventions that you follow within your organization and write them down. Once you have them written, once you have them defined, try to automate them with a custom linter. And if you do automate any cool checks, if you do create any cool rules, I would really invite you to contribute back to lintercop. Now, it doesn't really have to be with pull requests. It can also be just with your participation on discussions. But I think with a great community linter, the whole community can write better code. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. If you have any questions, now is the perfect time. If you'll have questions later, find me on LinkedIn, find me on Twitter. And I'd also like to mention that every time I do a presentation, I also upload the slides to my blog, so feel free to check that out. And now over to you, Luc.
Yeah, and of course, if you have questions later on, you might also put them as comments on our YouTube channel underneath the recording. So there are various options. Yeah, there are a couple of questions. One from Archim. Recently, we had an issue. The compiler, when provided with several code cops, one of which is defective, will not output rule violations from the working code cops either. Is that a known issue?
By working code cops, you mean from Microsoft?
So you can select from the list as you show the drop down. Apparently, they had selected a number of them, and one of them, I don't know which one, but one of them was defective, and apparently all the other 4 didn't yield any output. So apparently that defective one was blocking any output on warnings or whatever. Is that a known issue?
Yeah. Not to me, not that I would know of. I have had this experience that if one of the code cops fails, all of them will start acting up. But if you disable that one, I assume others should behave correctly. Just one thing to keep in mind here, what could have caused this change, the pre-release version of AL language has recently switched already to 14, not to 13, which is coming in April. So that might have caused the issue with the faulty code cop.
Okay. And then a question from Gonzalo. Could we have your custom rules shared with the community? Well, more or less that's what you said already, I guess, as much as possible.
Yeah, the whole source code is on GitHub for our own cop. Feel free to use that. I do often talk with Arthur. What else could we move from Companion cop to linter cop? You need to understand that some of these rules are maybe too specific for Companion to be moved to linter cop, and that's why we still keep our own version of the tool. But we do try to move anything that's beneficial to linter cop.
And I guess as it's on GitHub, it's community available, so you could use anything from Companion cop. If it's not in linter cop, just take the source from there and build your own DLL, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Thanks. Very clear. There's another question now just coming in from Matt. Is there a way to view Microsoft Code Cops code? Do you know about that? Is there?
Yes.
Probably there's one of those repos, right?
It's not actually in the repository, so officially there isn't a repository that you could navigate to. However, you can decompile their DLLs and you will find the full source code there. So with tools like .peek, for example, you can just select one of their analyzers and it will show you the full source code. I've used that from time to time to get, well, not inspiration, but to find out how they have implemented a certain rule.
Clear. I know that you're going to present on BC Tech Days, and there's some relation between this topic and the topic of the session that got approved for you to execute on BC Tech Days, but that's more at a higher level on this is the tooling let's say, perspective, but there is more at the higher level. What do you do with reviewing, if I understood it right?
Yeah, so the session at Tech Days is going to primarily focus on how can we improve the code review process. And part of that is, well, if we have an analysis tool that checks for all the little things, we don't have to spend that time during the code review, which of course shortens the time.
Yeah. And then I'm very interested, and I will probably be in your session, and then you get to the point. What I always do is I never spend more than 10 minutes or 15 minutes on a review, because I have my peers also reviewing it. And so I like those dots. Some people instantly see it, that there's a dot missing in the tooltip, which I fully agree, automate these kind of things. But there's always, my view is different than yours, so I can spend more and more time on it, maybe find it, but probably you have seen it in just a number of seconds. But that's another discussion, and maybe we get that in a follow-up session anyway sometime. Thank you very much. One remark to be made: Linter Cop, Stefan Maron took it over from Marije Brummel, so that's the original source. That's where it started, and the name changed, but that was the she built the first version and found Stefan willing to pick up and make it into something that's now usable for us all.
Thank you. Did not know that.
Yeah. Let me take over the screen to share the last slide to thank you, specifically Tine, and of course everybody else that joined in today. Well, that's it, I guess. Thanks.
Thank you.